The operating room lights were too bright, too cold. Blake Mitchell's eyes darted between the masked faces hovering above him as Dr. Rachel Hoffman's forceps disappeared into the incision on his right cheek. He was awake, lightly sedated but conscious, because they needed him to tell them if he felt numbness, tingling, the first sign that something had gone wrong. "Almost there," Dr. Hoffman murmured, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from her shoulders. Blake felt it then. Not pain, but something worse. Movement. A sliding sensation beneath his skin, like something was retreating deeper into his face, trying to escape. "It's fighting back," the resident whispered. Dr. Hoffman's forceps locked onto something solid. She pulled, slowly, steadily. The wet schlorp that followed made the nurse gasp. "Got it." But 3 months earlier, Blake had been a different man entirely. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Late September in Portland meant rain-slicked streets and the smell of coffee drifting from every corner. Blake Mitchell's apartment sat in the Pearl District, a converted loft filled with camera equipment and the kind of minimalist furniture that suggested someone who spent more time looking through a viewfinder than at his own walls. He was 29, though most people guessed younger. Tall and lean, with the kind of face that photographed well, symmetrical features, clear skin, the sort of natural handsomeness that had briefly made him consider modeling before he'd found his true calling behind the camera. His Instagram had 150,000 followers, a number that had grown steadily over 3 years of posting wildlife photography from the Pacific Northwest. The brand partnerships had started small. A hiking boot company here, a camera strap manufacturer there, but lately the offers had gotten bigger. Outdoor Gear Co. had reached out about a skincare line collaboration. REI wanted him for their summer catalog. Blake Mitchell wasn't just a photographer anymore, he was becoming a brand himself. That morning he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, performing the ritual he'd done countless times before. Check the angle, turn left, then right. Examine the skin for any imperfection that might show up in harsh camera light. A small mole near his jawline, the faint scar from a childhood bike accident. He knew every detail of his own face better than anyone else's. His phone buzzed on the counter. Maddie Carter's name appeared on the screen with a text. "Running late. Traffic on Burnside is hell." Maddie was 28, sharp-minded and ambitious, working in marketing for a tech startup downtown. They'd been together 8 months, long enough to have keys to each other's apartments, but not long enough to talk seriously about moving in together. She was beautiful in that polished professional way, always put together, always camera-ready for the Instagram stories they posted together, the perfect couple for the algorithm. What Blake didn't know was that beneath Maddie's carefully chosen high-waisted jeans and fitted blazers, she carried thick keloid scars across her abdomen. Scars from a car accident 9 years earlier. Scars from an emergency surgery that had saved her life but taken something else. She never talked about it, and Blake had never seen them. She made sure of that. In the bottom drawer of his desk, buried beneath old hard drives and unused camera straps, sat a small wooden box. Blake had inherited it 2 years ago when his grandmother died, or so he'd thought at the time. The box contained his grandfather's Purple Heart medal, a faded photograph of a young soldier in uniform, and an envelope he'd never bothered to open. William Mitchell had died before Blake was born, a Vietnam veteran who'd become more myth than man in family stories. Blake's relationship with his father, Robert, had grown distant over the years. They spoke maybe twice a year, brief phone calls that never went deeper than surface pleasantries. Blake knew his father resented the grandfather somehow, but he'd never understood why, and he'd never cared enough to ask. Blake had spent 3 weeks in Olympic National Forest, a dense wilderness area in Washington state just north of the Oregon border. The assignment was self-directed, a portfolio piece he hoped would land him a feature in National Geographic, nocturnal wildlife photography, the kind that required patience, expensive infrared equipment, and a willingness to sleep in a tent while things rustled in the darkness outside. The weather had been unseasonably warm for late September, humid in a way that felt wrong for the Pacific Northwest. Climate scientists had been talking about shifting patterns, warmer temperatures creeping north, but Blake hadn't paid much attention to the news. He was focused on the shots. A family of elk at dawn, an owl swooping through moonlight, the ethereal quality of mist rising from the lake at first light. On the third day, he'd noticed the flies, not the ordinary kind, but larger ones that seemed to hover with purpose near his campsite by the water. He'd swatted several away while setting up his equipment, felt one land on his neck. By day 8, he'd woken with a small bump on his right cheek just below the eye. It looked like a mosquito bite, slightly raised and red. He'd dabbed some antibiotic ointment on it and forgotten about it. The forest had given him some of his best work. He'd captured a particularly striking image of an elk standing in morning light. And when he'd zoomed in during editing, he'd noticed something interesting. The animal had several raised bumps along its back and shoulders. Warbles, he'd learned they were called, caused by botfly larvae that lived beneath the skin of wild animals. He'd found it fascinating in a detached, documentary way. Nature's perfect imperfections, he'd thought. He'd even drafted an Instagram caption about it. By day 15, the bump on his face was still there, slightly larger but not painful. He'd used concealer to cover it for an Instagram story, just a quick clip talking about the importance of patience in wildlife photography. The comments had been full of heart emojis and questions about his camera settings. Nobody had noticed anything wrong with his face. When he'd returned home on day 19, Maddie had been waiting at his apartment with Thai takeout and questions about the trip. She'd kissed him, then pulled back slightly, her eyes catching on his cheek. "What's that?" she'd asked, her finger hovering near but not quite touching the swelling. "Bug bite," Blake had said, dismissing it with a shrug. "You should see the mosquitoes up there." But by Monday morning, October 14th, the bump had grown more pronounced. Blake stood in his bathroom, examining it in the harsh LED light he'd installed for exactly this purpose, to catch every imperfection. The swelling was about the size of a dime now, raised and warm to the touch. The skin around it had taken on a faint redness. His first instinct was to try to pop it, the same instinct everyone has when faced with something protruding from their skin. But he'd read enough dermatology articles to know better. Messing with cysts could lead to infection, scarring. He applied tea tree oil instead, a natural remedy he'd seen recommended online. Then he sat down at his computer and opened the email that had arrived the previous Friday. Subject: Outdoor Gear Co. Partnership opportunity. $25,000. The message outlined a collaboration for their new skincare line marketed to outdoor enthusiasts. The photo shoot would feature Blake prominently, close-ups of his face, before and after shots, lifestyle imagery. The timeline was tight. 2 weeks to shooting, $25,000, enough to cover 3 months of rent and then some. Blake touched the bump on his face and felt his stomach tighten with worry. Maddie noticed the swelling had gotten worse on Tuesday morning. She'd stayed over, and when Blake emerged from the bathroom after his usual lengthy mirror examination, she was sitting up in bed with her coffee, watching him with concern etched across her features. "Blake, that's not just a bug bite anymore," she said, setting down her mug. "You need to get that looked at." "It's fine," Blake said automatically, though he'd spent the last 20 minutes in the bathroom pressing gently on the bump, feeling something he couldn't quite identify beneath the surface. Not liquid, something more solid. Just a cyst or something. They go away on their own. "Not in 2 weeks, they don't." Maddie's voice carried an edge he recognized, the same tone she used in marketing meetings when a campaign was going off track. "The shoot's coming up. You need to fix this." The word "fix" landed harder than she'd probably intended. Blake felt a flash of irritation. "It's not about the money," he said. Maddie's expression softened, and for a moment he saw genuine worry behind the practical concern. "I know it's not. But Blake, we're barely making rent as it is. My mom's medical bills—" She stopped herself, a habit she had of starting to share something real before pulling back. "Just see someone. Please." That afternoon, Blake sat in the waiting room of a community clinic in Northwest Portland. The space smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. A Norman Rockwell print hung on the wall, a doctor examining a young boy, everyone smiling, medicine as it existed in some idealized past. Blake filled out forms and tried not to think about the $150 copay he couldn't really afford. "Doctor." Thomas Reed was in his mid-50s with thinning gray hair and the kind demeanor of someone who'd spent decades in family medicine. He examined Blake's face with gentle, practiced hands, pressing around the swelling while Blake sat rigidly in the paper-covered exam chair. "Feels like a sebaceous cyst," Dr. Reed said finally, rolling back on his stool. "Pretty common, especially in young men. Nothing to worry about." "It feels like it moves sometimes," Blake said, the admission making him feel foolish even as he spoke it. Dr. Reed smiled in that reassuring way doctors have perfected. "That's just inflammation putting pressure on the nerves in your face. Creates odd sensations. Your body's way of saying, 'Leave me alone and let me heal.'" He wrote out a prescription for cephalexin, an antibiotic, and suggested warm compresses 3 times a day. "Should clear up in a week or 2, he said, already standing, signaling the appointment was over. "You'll be camera ready again in no time." Blake wanted to believe him. He took the prescription to the pharmacy, paid another $40 he couldn't spare, and started the antibiotics that evening. For 2 days, he convinced himself it was working. The redness seemed slightly less angry. The swelling might have been marginally smaller, though it was hard to tell if that was real or just what he wanted to see. He posted carefully angled photos on Instagram, always keeping the right side of his face in shadow. On Thursday evening, October 17th, Blake made a decision that would change everything. He'd been avoiding social media beyond his curated posts, but his follower engagement had been dropping. His manager had suggested an Instagram live session, a QA about wildlife photography, casual and authentic, the kind of content that built real connection with an audience. He set up his ring light and phone mount, checked his appearance one more time. The concealer covered the bump reasonably well under the bright, even lighting. He looked tired but presentable, professional. He went live at 7 p.m. Within minutes, 500 people had joined. For the first 8 minutes, everything went perfectly. Blake talked about camera settings for low-light photography, answered questions about his favorite locations, felt himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of performance. The comments scrolled past, mostly positive, full of heart emojis and technical questions. Then at minute 9, a comment appeared. "Dude, is your face moving?" Blake laughed it off, touched his cheek self-consciously. "What? No, just a muscle twitch probably." But more comments came. "I saw it too," and "left side below your eye." Blake leaned closer to the camera to prove there was nothing wrong, and under the unforgiving brightness of the ring light, it happened. A visible ripple across his right cheek, like the surface of water disturbed by something swimming beneath. He saw it on his monitor. The chat exploded with reactions, shocked emojis, disbelief, concern, and worse, disgust. Blake's throat went dry. He tried to laugh again, but it came out strangled. "Just a technical difficulty," he managed, and ended the stream with shaking hands. Within 20 minutes, someone had screen recorded the moment. Within an hour, it was on TikTok with the caption, "Something's living in this photographer's face." By midnight, the video had 50,000 views. Blake didn't sleep that night. He sat in the glow of his laptop screen watching the numbers climb. The TikTok video had been cross-posted to Twitter, then Reddit, where it had found a home on multiple forums. People were analyzing the footage frame by frame, offering theories that ranged from reasonable to absurd. "It's obviously a botfly. I've seen this in animals. CGI for attention. Photographers know editing. Dude needs a hospital, not a live stream." One comment thread had devolved into people sharing photos of similar conditions, each more disturbing than the last. Blake slammed his laptop shut at 3 in the morning, his hands trembling, but sleep never came. He lay in bed listening to Maddie's steady breathing beside him, feeling utterly alone despite her presence. Friday morning brought an email from Outdoor Gear Co. The subject line was innocuous enough. "Quick check-in, re-timeline." But Blake could read between the corporate speak lines. They were worried. They wanted to discuss adjusting the campaign strategy and explore alternative approaches. They hadn't pulled out yet, but they were preparing to. Maddie found him at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at his phone. She'd already seen the video. Everyone had seen the video. Her face was pale, but she sat down across from him and reached for his hand. "We need to get you to a specialist," she said quietly. "Not the clinic. A real hospital." Blake finally nodded. The fight had gone out of him. The drive to Oregon Health and Science University took 2 hours through gray morning rain. Maddie drove while Blake sat in the passenger seat, face turned toward the window, watching the city give way to highway, then back to city again. The radio played softly, some classic soul station. Sam Cooke's "You Send Me" came on, and Blake nearly asked her to change it, but something in the melody held him still. They passed the Oregon Veterans Hospital on the way, a sprawling complex of buildings that seemed to sink into the hillside. Blake stared at it as they drove past, thinking about his grandfather for the first time in months. William Mitchell had died in a place like that, according to family legend, a veterans hospital somewhere in the Midwest, far from his family, his body finally giving out after carrying something inside it for decades. "What are you thinking about?" Maddie asked. "Nothing," Blake lied. "Just tired." Dr. Rachel Hoffman's office was nothing like the community clinic. The walls were covered with photographs from field work, images of rainforests, research stations, indigenous communities. One photo in particular caught Blake's eye. Dr. Hoffman in field clothes, wearing gloves, holding forceps that gripped something pale and segmented she'd just extracted from the back of a howler monkey. "That's what you have, Doctor," Hoffman said when she entered, following Blake's gaze. She was in her early 40s with sharp blue eyes and gray streaking through her dark hair. "Isn't it?" She examined Blake's face with a dermoscope, a small handheld device that magnified the skin. After a long moment, she pointed to something Blake couldn't see. "There," she said. "That's the punctum, the breathing hole, about 1 millimeter across." Blake's stomach turned. "Breathing hole?" Dr. Hoffman pulled back and met his eyes with a directness that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. She wasn't going to sugarcoat this. "You have a botfly larva under your skin, Dermatobia hominis, human botfly. They're native to Central and South America, but we've been seeing them more frequently in the Pacific Northwest over the last few years." "Climate change," Blake said numbly. "Among other factors, Doctor." Hoffman pulled up a map on her computer screen, showing the historical range of botflies overlaid with current data. The territory had crept steadily northward. The warmer, wetter conditions are allowing them to establish populations farther north. "You're the 4th case I've seen this year, all from the Olympic Forest region." She explained the life cycle with clinical precision. The botfly doesn't directly lay eggs on humans. Instead, it captures a mosquito or other biting insect and attaches its eggs to it. When the insect bites, body heat triggers the eggs to hatch, and the tiny larvae burrow into the skin. There, they feed and grow, using the host's tissue as nutrients, breathing through a small hole they create in the skin. "How long?" Blake asked. "Based on the size, I'd estimate 3 to 4 weeks. You probably got it early in your forest trip." She paused. "It'll mature in another 2 to 4 weeks, then emerge on its own to pupate." The thought of something living inside him for that long, feeding on him, made Blake's vision swim. Maddie had gone very still in the chair beside him. "Or we can remove it," Dr. Hoffman continued. She pulled up an ultrasound image on another screen from a previous patient. "I'll need to do an ultrasound to see exactly where it is and how close to the facial nerve structures." The ultrasound room was dark and cool. Blake lay back as Dr. Hoffman spread gel across his cheek and pressed the probe against his skin. The monitor flickered to life with grayscale images that meant nothing to Blake at first, just abstract shapes and shadows. Then the image resolved. A dark cavity in the tissue, an elongated structure inside it, segmented like an insect's body. And as they watched, it moved, not a drift or a shift, but a deliberate curling motion, like something stretching in sleep. The ultrasound technician made a small sound of surprise. Dr. Hoffman leaned closer to the screen, her expression focused and clinical, but Blake saw her fingers tighten on the probe. Maddie stood abruptly and walked out of the room. Blake heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway but couldn't take his eyes off the monitor. That thing, that living, moving thing, was inside his face, had been inside his face for weeks. All those times he'd felt something shift beneath his skin, he'd been right. It hadn't been his imagination or inflamed nerves. "The good news," Dr. Hoffman said after a long moment, "is that it appears to be intact and not infected. The bad news is its position." She showed him on the screen, pointing to structures Blake couldn't identify. The larva was nestled against what she called the zygomatic branch of his facial nerve, the nerve that controlled his ability to smile, to move the muscles around his eye and mouth. They reconvened in Dr. Hoffman's office. Maddie had returned, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed. Dr. Hoffman laid out 3 options with the measured tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. Option 1, occlusion therapy. Seal the breathing hole with petroleum jelly, suffocate the larva, let the body expel it naturally. Success rate 60%. Risk. If it didn't work, the dead larva could cause a massive infection. Option 2, simple extraction. Local anesthetic. Enlarge the breathing hole, pull it out with forceps. Success rate 70%. Risk. The larva could break apart, leaving fragments behind. Option 3, surgical excision. Full surgical suite. Conscious sedation, proper incision and dissection. Success rate 95%. Risk, damage to the facial nerve. Potential outcomes included drooping, asymmetry, difficulty smiling or speaking clearly. Possibly permanent. Dr. Hoffman pulled up a 3-dimensional model of facial anatomy on her computer, rotating it to show the delicate branching of nerves beneath the skin. She pointed to the areas the larva was touching. Then she did something that made the choice viscerally real. She demonstrated on her own face, using her muscles to lift only the left side of her mouth while the right remained still. The effect was unsettling, a half smile that looked like a grimace. "That's worst-case scenario," she said. "But you need to understand what you're risking." Blake stared at the model, at the maze of nerves and blood vessels and tissues that made up a face, his face. the face that was his livelihood, his identity, his interface with the world. "What if I do nothing?" he asked. "It will eventually mature and emerge on its own. But there's a risk of migration. It could move deeper toward your orbital cavity or even into cranial spaces. If that happens, I could lose my eye. Or die. In worse cases, yes." Blake looked at Maddie. She was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white, staring at a point on the wall somewhere past his shoulder. "What would you do?" Blake asked Dr. Hoffman. "If it was you?" She held his gaze. "I'd remove it, but I can't make that choice for you." Dr. Hoffman gave Blake 24 hours to decide, but told him not to wait longer. The larva was growing, and with growth came increased risk of complications. Blake and Maddie drove back to Portland in silence heavier than before, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the autumn rain. That evening, Maddie said she needed space. Not from him, she insisted, but to think, to process. Blake watched her pack an overnight bag with hands that moved mechanically, efficiently, like she was checking items off a list rather than leaving him. She kissed his forehead, carefully avoiding his right cheek, and promised to call in the morning. The apartment felt cavernous without her. Blake stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment, and felt utterly purposeless. He pulled out his phone and made the mistake of checking his social media. The video had passed 200,000 views. His Instagram DMs were flooded with messages ranging from genuine concern to morbid curiosity to outright cruelty. One message stood out. "Imagine kissing that." He closed the app with shaking hands. At 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, Blake found himself standing in front of the drawer where he'd shoved his grandfather's box years ago. He didn't remember deciding to open it, but suddenly it was in his hands, the wood smooth and cool against his palms. Inside was the Purple Heart medal, tarnished with age. The photograph of William Mitchell in his Marine Corps uniform, young and serious-eyed, staring at the camera with the expression of someone who'd already seen too much. And beneath it, something Blake had never noticed before. A yellowed envelope with words written in shaky handwriting. "To my grandson, when you face your crossroads." Blake's hands trembled as he opened it. The letter inside was dated March 2007, just months before his grandfather had died. The letter began without preamble, William Mitchell's voice coming through in plain, unflinching language. He wrote about February 1968, about a firefight in Da Nang that had gone wrong, about the bullet that had lodged between his T4 and T5 vertebrae, about the Navy doctor who'd given him a choice: surgery with a 50-50 chance of paralysis from the neck down, or living with the bullet inside him, never knowing if today would be the day it shifted and killed him. William had chosen to keep the bullet. Blake read the words twice, 3 times, trying to understand. His father had wanted William to have the surgery. The letter explained, had called him a coward, called him selfish. But William had known something his son didn't understand. Life wasn't about being perfect or whole. It was about being present. "I kept that bullet for 40 years, William had written. "Felt it every day, every time I bent to pick up your daddy when he was little. Every time I danced with your grandma, every time I took a deep breath. But I also felt alive. That bullet was my reminder. I chose life on my terms." The letter went on to explain that Blake's father, Robert, had never forgiven him, had resented the choice, believing William had stolen the real father he could have had. But William had given him something else, a father who was there, who coached his Little League team, who walked him down the aisle, who held him when Blake's mother had left. "You're gonna face a choice like this someday, Blake," the letter continued. Something inside you that could kill you if you dig too deep, or kill you if you leave it alone. Don't let nobody tell you which is right, not doctors, not family, not fear. Ask yourself, which choice lets you keep dancing? The letter ended simply. Choose life, boy, however that looks for you. Semper Fi. Blake sat on his apartment floor, the letter pressed against his chest, and cried for the first time since the live stream incident. Not for himself, but for a grandfather he'd never known. For a father who'd wasted 40 years being angry at a choice he'd never understood. For all the time he'd lost not knowing this story. He looked at the consent forms Dr. Hoffman had given him, still sitting on his kitchen counter. Then he looked at his phone, at the camera that had become both his livelihood and his prison. At 7 the next morning, Blake made a decision that surprised even himself. He set up his camera with the ring light, but this time he didn't apply concealer. The bump was visible, angry and red against his skin. He looked tired, disheveled, real in a way he'd never allowed himself to be on camera before. He went live. Within minutes, 50,000 people had joined, 10 times his usual audience. They'd come for the spectacle, he knew, but he was going to give them something else. Blake held up the ultrasound image. "This is what's inside my face," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "It's a botfly larva. It's been growing there for almost 4 weeks." He explained what it was, how he'd gotten it, what his options were. Then he held up his grandfather's letter. "My grandfather lived for 40 years with a bullet in his spine," Blake said. "Doctors told him the same thing mine are telling me. Surgery might fix it, or it might destroy everything. He chose to live with it. Everyone thought he was crazy. My dad spent his whole life angry about that choice." Blake's voice cracked, but he pushed through. "I'm having the surgery tomorrow. I'm choosing to cut it out, even though I might lose my face, my career, maybe everything that makes me recognizable. But here's what I learned from my grandfather's letter. You're not measured by what you carry. You're measured by what you do with it." He talked about perfectionism, about the parasites that weren't physical. Fear. The need for approval, the constant performance of a curated life. "I spent weeks hiding this," he admitted. "Wearing makeup, angling my camera, pretending everything was fine. That's the real infection. The hiding. The shame." His voice grew stronger. "Surgery's tomorrow. I'll probably be fine. But if I'm not, at least I'll be free of one thing: lying. About what I'm going through. About being scared. About being human and imperfect and carrying things that might destroy me." He ended the stream without reading comments, without checking the reaction. It didn't matter anymore. 3 hours later, Maddie showed up at his door. She'd watched the live stream. Her eyes were red, but there was something different in her expression, a kind of resolve. "I need to tell you something," she said. They sat on his couch, and Maddie lifted her shirt to reveal the keloid scars across her abdomen. Blake stared, not in horror but in confusion. How had he never seen these? "Car accident when I was 19, she said quietly. "I was 7 months pregnant." Blake's breath caught. She'd never mentioned a pregnancy. "I lost the baby. Emergency C-section. The scars. They healed wrong." Her voice broke. "I've been hiding them from everyone. From you." The surgery was scheduled for Monday morning, but by Sunday evening everything had changed. Blake woke feeling wrong. Not the usual discomfort he'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks, but something sharper, more insistent. His face felt hot to the touch, and when he looked in the mirror, his heart sank. The swelling that had been concentrated below his right eye had diminished, but there was new swelling higher up near his temple. It had moved. He called Dr. Hoffman's emergency line with trembling fingers. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. When he described what he was seeing, there was a pause that lasted too long. "Get to the hospital now," she said. "It's migrating toward your orbital cavity." The emergency room on a Sunday night was a particular kind of chaos. Maddie drove while Blake sat rigid in the passenger seat, one hand pressed against his face as if he could physically hold the larva in place. Every minute felt like an eternity, every red light a potential disaster. His eye socket. The thing was moving toward his eye. They fast-tracked him through triage. Dr. Hoffman arrived within the hour, still in street clothes, her hair pulled back hastily. She examined him under harsh fluorescent lights while Blake tried to hold still, tried not to think about what orbital cavity meant in practical terms. "We need to do this tonight," Dr. Hoffman said. "It's too close to critical structures to wait." There was no time for the philosophical debate, no 24 hours to reconsider. Blake was being prepped for surgery within 30 minutes, signing consent forms he barely read, changing into a hospital gown that felt like surrender. Maddie held his hand in the pre-op area. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too," Blake said, and found odd comfort in the honesty. She was still holding his hand when the anesthesiologist inserted the IV line. "I'll be right here," she promised, "however this goes." Blake wanted to tell her about his grandfather's letter, about choosing life, about all the things he'd finally understood too late. But the sedative was already working, making his thoughts slow and syrupy. The last thing he saw before they wheeled him away was Maddie pressing his grandfather's Purple Heart medal against her chest like a talisman. The operating room was exactly as he'd imagined from medical dramas, too bright, too cold, too clean. They positioned him on the table and told him they'd be using conscious sedation. He'd be awake but calm, able to respond to commands, able to tell them if he felt anything wrong. "We need you conscious to test nerve function," Dr. Hoffman explained, her face now masked, only her eyes visible above the blue surgical drape. "Can you smile for me, Blake?" He smiled. The muscles responded normally, pulling his mouth upward in the familiar expression he'd practiced in mirrors his whole life. "Good. We're going to begin now." The local anesthetic made everything feel distant, like his face belonged to someone else. He felt pressure, tugging, the strange sensation of instruments moving beneath his skin. Dr. Hoffman's voice was calm, narrating each step for the surgical resident assisting her. "Scalpel. Retracting the skin now. I can see the capsule." Blake stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them to keep his mind occupied. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere in the room, a monitor beeped steadily with his heartbeat. "It's larger than the ultrasound showed," Dr. Hoffman said, and Blake heard the subtle shift in her tone. Concern, carefully controlled. Then he felt it. That familiar, sliding sensation, but stronger now, more desperate. The thing inside his face was moving, retreating from the instruments, burrowing deeper toward safety. Toward his eye. "It's retracting," Dr. Hoffman said sharply. "I need to cut the anchors before it—" An alarm sounded. The nerve monitor. The days following surgery blurred together in a haze of pain medication and fluorescent hospital lights. Blake woke in recovery with his face bandaged, his right eye swollen nearly shut, and a fever that spiked to 102 degrees by evening. The infection had set in faster than anyone expected. Dr. Hoffman had gotten the larva out. That much was clear from the specimen jar they'd shown him. The cream-colored thing with its black spine suspended in preservative fluid like some grotesque museum piece. But botflies, she explained, secreted compounds into the tissue around them, antimicrobial substances that sometimes caused delayed inflammatory responses in human hosts. The wound site had become infected despite the antibiotics, despite everything they'd done right. They reopened the incision on the second day, debrided the infected tissue. Blake was awake for it this time too, staring at the ceiling while they cut away pieces of him he couldn't see. When they finally let him look in a mirror, the incision was twice as long as before, an angry red line that curved from below his eye nearly to his ear. "There will be scarring," Dr. Hoffman said, her voice gentle but honest. "More than we hoped." Blake traced the line with his fingertips, feeling the sutures beneath the bandage. His face, the face that had been his fortune, his brand, his carefully maintained product, was ruined. He thought about the outdoor gear campaign, the $25,000 that would never materialize now. He thought about his Instagram followers who'd come for the aesthetic and would leave now that the illusion was broken. Maddie stayed. She slept in the chair beside his bed, brought him lukewarm hospital coffee, held his hand through the worst of the fever dreams. But Blake saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she sometimes stared at the wall instead of at him, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. On the third day, an email arrived that confirmed what Blake already knew. Outdoor Gear Co. had decided to move in a different creative direction. REI sent a similar message, more apologetic but equally final. The brand partnerships that had sustained him for the past year evaporated like morning fog. Blake pulled up his banking app with shaking hands, $8,000 in savings. The hospital bill, even after insurance, was going to be at least $15,000. He was going to lose his apartment. His equipment would have to be sold. Everything he'd built was collapsing. "I'm going to lose everything," he said to Maddie that night, his voice hollow. She didn't argue with him, didn't offer empty reassurances. She just squeezed his hand and said, "We'll figure it out." But the real blow came on the fourth day, when a man Blake hadn't seen in 2 years walked into his hospital room. Robert Mitchell stood in the doorway, looking older than Blake remembered. His father's hair had gone mostly gray, his face lined with the kind of wear that came from factory work and worry. He held his coat awkwardly in both hands, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. "Your girlfriend called me," Robert said. "Said you were in trouble." Blake felt a surge of anger cut through the medication fog. "What do you want?" Robert stepped into the room, his eyes finding Blake's bandaged face. Something in his expression cracked. "Jesus, Blake. What were you thinking? Going into the forest alone, always chasing some shot, never thinking about the consequences?" "Don't," Blake said sharply. "Just like your grandfather," Robert continued, the words spilling out like they'd been dammed up for years. "Making stupid choices, risking everything for some principle. He could have had the surgery, could have been normal, but no. He had to be the martyr with his bullet." Blake pushed himself up in the hospital bed, ignoring the pain that lanced through his face. "I read his letter." Robert froze. "What letter?" "The one he left for me. In the box, with his medal." Blake's voice was steady despite the fury building in his chest. "The one where he explained why he kept the bullet, why he chose 40 years with you over maybe being paralyzed." The color drained from Robert's face. "There was a letter? You never knew?" Blake stared at his father. "You spent 40 years angry at him, and you never even knew why he made that choice?" Robert sank into the chair Maddie had vacated, his coat falling to the floor. "I thought he said the surgery was too risky. I thought he was being stubborn, selfish, choosing his pride over his family." "He chose being there over being perfect," Blake said quietly. "He chose to dance with Grandma and coach your Little League team and walk you down the aisle. He chose life with you, even if it meant carrying something that could kill him every day." Tears were running down Robert's face now, cutting tracks through the years of resentment. "I wasted all that time being angry." "Yeah," Blake said. "You did." They sat in silence, the hospital machines beeping their steady rhythm. Finally, Robert spoke again, his voice broken. "I'm sorry. For the distance. For not understanding what he sacrificed. For not being there when you needed me." Blake wanted to stay angry. Anger was easier than the grief that waited beneath it. But looking at his father, really looking at him for the first time in years, he saw the same fear he'd been carrying. The fear of making wrong choices, of being judged for them, of losing time that could never be recovered. "I'm sorry too," Blake said finally, "for judging you, for judging him. For all the years we lost?" Robert didn't try to hug him. Too much history stood between them for that. But he moved his chair closer to the bed. They sat together in the hospital room, two men carrying different wounds, beginning the slow work of healing. On the 5th day post-op, Dr. Hoffman brought Blake the pathology report. She sat on the edge of his bed, the folder open in her lap, and began reading sections aloud. The larva had been intact when removed. Dermatobia hominis, 3rd instar, 32 millimeters long. But there was something unusual in the findings, something that made Dr. Hoffman pause before explaining. "The larva showed signs of growth retardation," Dr. Hoffman said, looking up from the pathology report. "Based on its developmental stage, it should have matured in 6 weeks, but it had been in you for 8, possibly 9 weeks." Blake frowned, trying to process through the lingering fog of pain medication. "Why?" Dr. Hoffman flipped to another page, pointing to a section dense with medical terminology. "Your wound site showed elevated cortisol markers, extremely elevated, the kind of levels we see in people with chronic, severe psychological stress." "I don't understand." "Blake, your body was flooded with stress hormones for weeks. From the moment you noticed the bump and started worrying about it, your cortisol levels were through the roof. That created a hostile environment for the larva. It couldn't thrive. Your anxiety essentially starved it, slowed its development." Blake stared at her, the irony hitting him like a physical blow. "My perfectionism, my constant stress, that's what kept it small?" "In a sense, yes. But there's more." Dr. Hoffman showed him a chart comparing his cortisol levels from different points. "When you were admitted for surgery, your cortisol was 28 micrograms per deciliter. That's very high. But we also have your levels from a routine blood draw 2 days after your public live stream. And 12 micrograms per deciliter. Normal range. Your stress levels dropped by more than half within 48 hours of going public with your condition." Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's when it started migrating." Dr. Hoffman nodded. "When you stopped hiding, when you released that psychological burden, your body chemistry changed. The larva suddenly had the energy and resources to move. Your authenticity gave it strength." The paradox was almost too much to process. Hiding had kept him safe, in a way. The very anxiety that had tormented him had also protected him. But it had also been killing him in a different way. Slowly, invisibly, from the inside out. "So, what does that mean?" Blake asked. "I was safer when I was miserable?" Dr. Hoffman closed the folder and looked at him directly. "You were safer from the parasite. But Blake, I've been treating infectious diseases for 20 years. I've seen what chronic stress does to people. It might have slowed the larva, but it was destroying you in other ways. Cardiovascular damage, immune suppression, psychological deterioration. You weren't safer. You were just dying differently." That evening, after Dr. Hoffman left, Blake sat alone with that knowledge. He thought about his grandfather's letter, about choosing which battles to fight, about the difference between survival and living. William Mitchell had carried his bullet for 40 years, but he'd done it while dancing with his wife, coaching his son, being present for the life he had. Blake had been surviving too, but in a prison of his own making. Maddie returned with dinner from the cafeteria, bland pasta and wilted salad, and found Blake staring at the specimen jar Dr. Hoffman had left on his bedside table. The larva floated in its preservative fluid, motionless now, harmless. "I need to tell you something," Maddie said, setting down the food. She pulled out her phone and showed him a bank transaction. $7,000 transferred to the hospital 3 days ago. Blake's throat tightened. "Maddie, no. That was your savings. Your studio money." "It was my choice," she said firmly. "Just like going public was yours, just like the surgery was yours. But I can't pay you back. I'm losing my apartment, my equipment." "Blake, stop." Maddie sat on the edge of his bed, her hand finding his. "I've been saving for a photography studio for 8 years. You know why I never opened it? Because I was terrified of people seeing me, really seeing me. The scars, the imperfections, everything I've been hiding." Tears were streaming down her face now. "You showed everyone your parasite, your literal one, and all the ones you'd been carrying. You were vulnerable even when it could destroy everything. That's worth more than $7,000. That's worth everything." Blake pulled her close, careful of his bandaged face, and they held each other in the sterile hospital room. Two broken people choosing to be broken together, choosing honesty over perfection. The next morning brought another unexpected visitor. Robert returned with a worn cardboard box Blake had never seen before. "I went through some of Dad's things last night," Robert said, setting the box on the foot of Blake's bed. "After what you said about the letter, I realized I'd never actually gone through everything. I was too angry." Inside the box were medical records from the Veterans Administration, yellowed with age. Photographs of William Mitchell at different ages, young and strong in his uniform, older with gray at his temples, teaching a young Robert to throw a baseball. And at the bottom, a leather journal. "His personal journal," Robert said, his voice thick. "I never read it. Couldn't bring myself to." Blake opened it with careful hands. The entries were sporadic, written in his grandfather's angular handwriting. He flipped to the last entry, dated March 15, 2007, 1 week before William Mitchell died. The entry described dancing with Blake's grandmother Margaret in their kitchen, a radio playing Sam Cooke. She'd asked if William regretted keeping the bullet. His answer was there in ink. "Every day. Because I might not be here to dance with you." Margaret had cried and told him, "You were always here." The entry continued. "I felt the bullet shift, just a millimeter. Reminder it's still there. No pain, just presence. If I could go back to that hospital room in '68, I'd make the same choice. Every time. Not because I was brave, because I was scared of the right thing, scared of losing more than my legs, losing my life." The final paragraph made both Blake and Robert cry. "Bobby still won't talk to me. Maybe he never will. That's my sacrifice. But I got to raise him, hold him. Even if he hates me for it, worth it." To whoever reads this, choose what you can live with, not what you can live without. Robert's hand shook as he turned the page. He died 4 days after writing this. Aneurysm in his sleep. Mom said he went peacefully. He looked at Blake, decades of regret in his eyes. "I wasted those 40 years being angry at him for a choice I never understood." "You didn't waste them," Blake said quietly. "He got to raise you. That's what he wanted. That's what he chose." Robert wiped his eyes. "What if I mess this up too? Us, I mean. I don't know how to be your father after all this time." Blake thought about the larva in the jar, about the scars on his face and on Maddie's abdomen, about his grandfather's bullet, and all the things people carried. "Then we'll both have scars," he said. "But at least we'll have each other." They sat together for a long time, the journal open between them, beginning the work of rebuilding what had been broken for so long. Blake was discharged on the 6th day. The bandages came off to reveal a 3-centimeter scar that curved below his right eye, angry and red, but cleanly sutured. It would fade to white eventually, Dr. Hoffman promised, but it would always be there. Blake stood in front of the hospital bathroom mirror and looked at himself, really looked for the first time without judgment. The scar was prominent. His face was asymmetrical now, the right side still slightly swollen. He would never be the perfect, curated version of himself that had existed in Instagram posts and brand campaigns. He looked real. He looked human. He looked like someone who had survived. Maddie drove him home to her apartment. He'd already given notice on his place, couldn't afford it anymore. His camera equipment was packed in boxes in her living room, waiting to be sold. Everything he'd built over 3 years was gone. But when they pulled up to her building, Robert was waiting outside with grocery bags. "Figured you'd need some real food," he said gruffly. "Hospital food isn't fit for anyone." They ate dinner together that night. The three of them crowded around Maddie's small kitchen table, eating Robert's somewhat overcooked pot roast. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't Instagram-worthy. But it was real. And for the first time in longer than Blake could remember, that felt like enough. Sometimes the things we carry inside us, fear, pride, old wounds we've never let anyone see, are harder to remove than anything a surgeon's knife can reach. Blake's grandfather understood this when he chose to keep that bullet for 40 years, not because he was reckless, but because he knew the difference between surviving and truly living. He chose to dance with his wife, to hold his son, to be present even with something deadly inside him. Blake learned the same lesson the hard way, that perfectionism is its own kind of parasite, that hiding our scars doesn't make us whole, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let people see us as we really are, broken, healing, imperfect, and beautifully human. In the end, it wasn't the surgery that saved Blake. It was choosing authenticity over the illusion of perfection, choosing connection over the safety of distance, choosing to dance with his burdens rather than let them dance alone in the dark. Have you ever carried something, a regret, a secret, a wound, that you thought would destroy you if anyone saw it? What would it take for you to finally set that burden down? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.